All right, let's talk about Barristan. Um, so Barristan 2 is much like Tyrion 1 and the second half of the Victorian chapter in that George did finish these chapters and did read them one time, but we don't have a very good record of what was contained in them. Unlike, say, when he read the Forsaken chapter and somebody ended up recording it and then transcribing the whole thing. So with Tyrion, with Victarion, there was very little about what that chapter was about. Just, a couple sentences was the only recollection that we ever got on that from one source. From Tyrion 1, there was about four different, very loose and contradictory um, uh, recollections of it. However, with Barristan, there is a fairly comprehensive outline of what occurred in the chapter in Barristan 2. There's some errors in it, and I don't know if understandably, this person is, listening and writing, and the errors, I don't know if they're George's, and I don't know if they're the transcriber or if they're the errors of Barristan Selmy. But we'll talk about those those errors and how we kind of dealt with them in the story, because certain things like don't meld when the information's kind of off or contradictory. Again, don't know if it's the transcriber or George or Barristan making these errors. Um, so so when you and I found this with Tyrion 1 and the second half of Victarion, is that very insecure about whether these chapters turned out okay. And I got a lot of positive feedback and everything, but still I feel very insecure about it all. And mainly because you're going with somebody else's outline, and some of the choices you wouldn't necessarily make, but you seem kind of you're kind of forced into it. Um, I'm thankful for the outline and everything, but and it's great that we have it, but it's certain choices are made that I wouldn't necessarily have made, but you're kind of locked in. So Barristan, so we began with this beginning. The hair beneath his helm had long ago turned white, but as he rode out through the city gates, he was a boy again. And the reason that we start like that is that the original outline, which is this is an outline of what George said at MizCon 2012, is when the Missouri sci-fi convention called MizCon in 2012, about 11 years ago, 11 and a half years ago, is when he read this. And so, according to that, they said, okay, his gut feels twisted from nervousness as he rides through the gates. He knows that the feeling will go away when time slows down in the chaos of battle. And so that's short, but and we did a lot with that, but it's that's the summary of what we have. His gut feels twisted as he rides through the gates, and he knows the feeling will go away when time slows down in the chaos of battle. And the chapter itself, so much is happening in a very short period of time that we really thought that the time slowing down in the chaos of battle was a very important element. This is a weird chapter. A lot is happening in seconds. He's thinking about a lot. He's doing a lot. He's looking at. It's just impossible, Like in reality, you ride out a gate, and then you're fighting. But here, like, so much is stretched out. So we really took this line here about him thinking about time slowing down and ran with it. And so, looking back at the let's go back to Barristan here. And so looking at that, I was like, okay, what are we going to do with that? Well, let's make the connection that Barristan is nervous. He's thinking about being a boy again. He's thinking about being Barristan the Bold, like that 10-year-old. And this kind of tracks in the sense that Barristan is paralleled to Little Walder, who is riding into battle. I'm sorry, Big Walder, who's riding into battle at the Battle of Ice as a 10-year-old boy, things like that. So you get, I really wanted to stress that this is what Barristan is feeling. The reason he's feeling nervous is he's once again a 10-year-old. And then there's this idea of him like exiting the gate is like him being reborn again, exiting a womb and being a boy again is this idea. But of course, like every time we do these chapters, the beginning gets changed so much. So originally it had a lot more description of the gates and everything and going out. And then there's also a feeling among editors that it should go right into the action of like he's riding. Why are we wasting time just dealing with gates and everything? And so this is kind of a compromise of, even though there's very little here, but I wanted to follow the exact outline of what was described. He exits the gate and he's feeling nervous, trying to get into the action as quick as possible, because there's a lot before the battle actually even begins. So want to get there as quick as possible. But this is the idea: is he's being reborn, even though he's this old man whose hair has turned white, and plus, like, Barristan 1 dealt with so much description of the city as well. We didn't really need any more description. So anyway, going based on that, we have like his gut twisted up in knots, his nerves frayed raw, his heart hammered in his chest like a bell in a tower. There's various things about like how nerves fraying are described by George R. Martin, because like it's an odd idea. Like, what is a nerve and what is fraying and what does that mean? Once George, for a while, it was his nerves were affray, which actually isn't a word, but there's a point in which George invents a word, affray, which appears earlier, and we were thinking about using affray again, but I went against it. I changed it, or an editor changed it, and I kind of stuck with it because of the meter of it. Like here, it's like it's an active verb, while like instead of having like his nerves were affray, like everything's an active verb. So his gut is twisting, his nerves are fraying, his heart is hammering, and so that's why it becomes. But then once it's going to fraying, we need some sort of object for it to be doing, or a description. Not an object, not an object, but like some sort of description of the verb. So he's twisting up in knots, he's fraying raw, his heart is hammering in his chest. These little things we think about. Anyway, so then we get into this, like, making it very explicit here. Hadn't he felt this the first time before they named him the Bold? This idea is the first time he was really feeling the nervousness of going into action is right before that first joust where he's a 10-year-old boy. Hadn't he felt this way every time since, and every time hadn't it all at once it had all at once quieted, and there was calm, magnificent calm. And it's good, we didn't want to get too much into, because he kind of describes the gloriousness of battle last time. So, but I want to get into the idea that like once he's in battle, everything's going to calm, and that's what they kind of said in the outline, that everything would quiet once he got into battle. And so we kind of have to follow that. What the actual thing said. The feelings would go away and time slows down. So he knew the nervousness would go away. So we kind of say that it's quiet. Okay, so then that's the nature of battle. The sheer chaos of it changes the world into something new, something clear, like the landscape of a dream. Time slows. The senses sharpen. The frightened child is pushed down deep within, and something else takes over. Editors kept trying to change this because there's more fluid and eloquent ways to say that, like, a child recedes or whatever. But I wanted it very explicitly that the frightened child is pushed down deep. That this is a reference to Hodor being a frightened child being pushed down deep, as something else takes over. And so I was very like specific on this. No, it's got to be, it can't be like, the anything else like receding or disappearing, or it's got to be a frightened child being pushed down. And so this is where we get like, because he's becoming he's a boy again, but there's this frightened child part of him too. And I mean, it's not a perfect one-to-one analogy, like who is Bran in this metaphor, but the idea is that Hodor is the child and he's being pushed down deep as something else takes over. We're not sure what that is. Like, what is Bran? What is that thing taking over? Some call it battle fever. Battle fever is something, if you go back to Tyrion at the Battle of the Blackwater, he talks about battle fever and something that he heard about from Jaime and then he experiences. So we want to talk about battle fever again, because this is what he's talking about, essentially. Time slowing, senses sharpening, everything. Being drunk, is all part of like Tyrion's experience. So this is again, but it's from Barristan's, explanation of it. So, more pious. We wanted to mention the religion because this gets very religious. Barristan, in his chapters, describes himself as not a pious knight, but then he starts talking about religion quite a bit. So I think he's becoming more religious over time. There are elements of that. And so he kind of says more pious knights might say the warrior's hand, or perhaps it was a drunkard lurking in the shadows of his mind for a chance to fill his thirsty cup with blood. But getting into this like idea of Tyrion talking about battle fever and being drunk. And he says, whatever it was, he surrendered to it willingly, Yeah, which is also like we kind of think about like when Hodor is pushed down deep in front of the cave and Bran takes over. There's a kind of battle fever in the same sense, like the frightened boy is pushed down and something else takes over. Bran as the battle fever in that situation. But that's what I was thinking about. As if it could read his thoughts, the silver slid into a gallop. It quickened hoofbeat, the chorus of thousand more. Pale dawn light raced. And just description, mud and stone and shrub, to meet the darkened figures laid out before them. The young mare Sir Barristan rode was the swiftest of the lot, easy pulling ahead of his likely host. Everybody joked about this, about Barristan being a horse, or Barristan being a warg or something. There's just kind of some... editors were making that joke too when we wrote it, but it seemed right to put it in like that. But no, he's not really a warg. But again, Dany's horse easily outpaced his lads and the rest of the cavalry. Okay, and then it says Barristan is pleased as he intends to outrun the widower and strike the first blow. And so we kind of get into this. Okay, Barristan's pleased, and he wants to outrun the widower. And there's a small change when we get kind of to this. So he's pleased. We get into this like, oh yes, a commander must be first in a battle to rouse the hearts of men. Barristan's kind of a stuck up kind of guy in the sense like, oh, they're all going to follow me. And this kind of evolved. So it's like, okay, where did he learn this from? Okay, well, maybe he learned it from the person he squired for, which is Lord Manfred. Lord Manfred, there's a contradiction in the text. Like he's called Sir Manfred and he's called Lord Manfred. So, or he's called Sir Manfred, but he's the Lord. So, let's call him Lord Manfred. And so Selmy, then says, okay, he's to the men, he'll be riding to he'll be the leader of the beacon amidst the coming storm. Kind of getting some poetry in there. Be Sir Grandfather no more. This is all to try to transition. Like each thing we work hard on, like transitioning the paragraphs. So like here he's riding out to be first, and then he thinks about being first and how he doesn't want to be Sir Grandfather, and then Sir Grandfather. Dario Naharis is the one to dumb the name. And we're giving him motivation on why he wants to outrun the widower. We make it the whole Stormcrows because they couldn't come up with a very good explanation. Like, we don't know who the widower is. So why would Barristan want to outrun him specifically? Like, we're not given that reason. Except, is the widower, because the widower is the head of the Stormcrows, but why does he want to, why is it so important that he wants to outrun the Stormcrows? Well, he wants to do it because Dario Naharis called him Sir Grandfather, and it all relates back to that he wants to be a leader. So we changed that a little bit, that he wants to outrun all of the Stormcrows instead of just the widower. It's a small one, but I think it made sense. And then it's like, okay, eventually we know that we needed to transition, because looking at the outline, that later there's a description of the Stormcrows take up the cry, and he thinks that he'll never doubt the valor of sellswords. And so we want to transition to that. It's weird in that the Yunkai are unprepared, and then he's talking about the Stormcrows, then the Yunkai are unprepared, and then he's talking about the Stormcrows, and then he's back to the Yunkai. So we did shift things around and move things, keep the Stormcrows information together, so that you're not whipping back and forth. So we give them a reason for why he wants to outrun them, and then we're getting into a description of the Stormcrows, so that we can eventually transition to, we talk about like who they are as people, so that we can transition to them. And so we're like, we give a random story on why Barristan doesn't like sellswords, that he was facing Nine Eyes on Bloodstone, and the Jolly Fellows. We don't know anything about Nine Eyes or the Jolly Fellows or anything, but let's make him a sellsword company. Bloodstone. This is the War of the Ninepenny Kings. We know nothing about this, but we just kind of put this in. Dario, they scream Stormcrows fly, and then we just kind of get description, joking, letting out a Yulian howl, Piper's trill, the widower smashing his axe. It's all just like for description, to eventually get to, no, he would never doubt the valor of sellswords, which is a line from the outline. Barristan thinks he would never again doubt the valor of sellswords. So all the work we do to try to keep with the outline for the most part. So then the outline doesn't really make sense. And so we just kind of have to change it. Like, they're only 30 yards. They are only 30 yards between the horse and the Yunkai legions by the time any of the defense are mounted. Like, that's 30 yards is nothing. That's like, it would take 1 second for a galloping horse to go 30 yards. Like, it's so weird that you couldn't have that kind of stuff. And then the air fills with arrows, and a squire for the Stormcrows is killed, and a bolt pierces Barristan's shield, and there are 3 horde blasts for the pit fighters to emerge. So we just had to delete the 30 yards thing, because it just didn't make sense for all of that to be happening in 1 second. Like, you just can't. Like, it's one thing for time to slow down and freeze, but you can't blow 3 horns and turn and have arrows fly up when you're 30 yards away. It just had to be cut. So what we do, what could you do at that point? So, but before we get to that, because they're kind of saying that the Yunkai are not prepared, but I wanted to get into I thought it was very important to mention, because it's weird that Dario talks about the Stormcrows and eventually talks about the pit fighters, but he doesn't talk about the Dothraki. And the Dothraki, I feel, are going to be very, very important, or at least they're going to be very, very important in the fanfic. And so there's this paragraph about who those Dothraki are, and I think the Dothraki have a very interesting story, and so the story is told here, where these are young and old Dothraki who were abandoned by all of the Khalasar when Khal Drogo died, and then again by Aggo and Rakaro when they went across the Skahazadon on their mission. So they're counted least among the people, not deemed fit for any Khalasar, and when the Blood Riders passed them over again for their mission across the Skahazadon, they were counted least among the least. Remnants of remnants, dregs of dregs. That made them angry, bitter, eager to prove themselves. How could they be otherwise? And band of cripples and children. And then that transitions to like the Yunkish, you know. So this is really important to bring up because the Dothraki are here, and if you notice, they disappear. In the rest of the story, there is no mention of the Dothraki. In fact, the original drafts, when we were going through it, they were there in various battles. And then I was like, nah, let's just delete them. Let's delete them because they're going to show up later, but Barristan loses track of them. So this is kind of a new thing we added here about the Dothraki. And so they're going to be part of the story later. They're very, very important. These 20 worst of the worst are going to be very, very important. So then, you know, he just gets this more description here of the Yunkish having their dregs too, transitioning from those dregs to these dregs, and the pink. He sees them like many-colored ants, just trying to be poetic here, because Barristan as a point of view is very, very poetic. He's probably only second to Tyrion in how poetic he is. He's and so you've just, to be Barristan, you've got to just constantly add, like, you know, things like that to the text. I mean, Catelyn is pretty poetic too, but, and so he says, pink. Was there any less fearsome color in battle? And that was that's kind of a joke about the Boltons at the Battle of Ice, because they're pink. That one came kind of by accident. One of the editors wrote like originally like, oh, isn't that was an unusual color, and then I was like, it's not that unusual. The Boltons are pink, and then I was like, well, let's make it a real color. Let's make that the point. Let's make that's the joke. Was there a less fearsome color? And then just kind of descriptions like behind the siege lines, Skahazadon, just giving people an image of what the battlefield looks like. Because I know this was like when people talked about the John Connington chapters we wrote, like, even though that I thought was a pretty simple setup, I know a lot of readers were still very confused on the setup, where people were, and what was happening. So we kind of want to make it clear that Barristan is heading out, and there's a single siege line, and he's just trying to pierce it, and then he's going to roll it up north, pierce, flank, the term rolling up, he uses it last chapter. We didn't use it this chapter, but to pierce and then flank up is to roll up in battle. So he just describes that the encampments begin at the Skahazadon and go far south, and straight ahead is their target, the Harridan, the lords of the trebuchets, and then looming over the camp like a giant wooden child wailing as it slung its bells in the air. Kind of more reference to children, maybe a reference to Sweet Robin, but I just kind of like that idea of like a wooden child slinging dolls. The bodies it's shooting are dolls, And then he gets the stirring information of the trumpets, from the outline that we kind of had. And then we have the arrows that he talked about. One trumpet signaled the archers. Flight of arrows came up, and then we get some action here. Shields, somebody raised his own. Jolt went through his arm, and then clanging, and he sees the bolt. Oh yeah, onward. He keeps moving. When he lowered the shield, he found it was a bolt from an Illyrian crossbow. This is all trying to mirroring the outline, and then it's funny because a lot of this, the evolution of these things is you kind of like, okay, what's going to happen in the paragraph? Oh, well, he's gonna get a bolt in his shield from a Illyrian crossbow. Okay, well, you can't just have like one sentence or two sentences. You got to cover more things. So what does Barristan think about that? Oh, okay, what direction did it come from? You didn't know where the Illyrians were. That's still kind of boring. What else we got? Well, then he decides to chant an old shield rhyme, and this come from I think one of one of the editors popped in the old Shield rhyme from, this is from, it's from Dunk and Egg. I'm trying to remember if it's Mystery Night. I think it's Mystery Night, where we learn the old Shield rhyme, Oak and Iron guard me well, or else I'm doomed to hell. And then it kind of like transitioned to like, oh, he says the doom to hell after he sees the squire drop, or squire fall from his horse. So we go back to the outline, and Squire from the Stormcrows is killed. Bolt pierces him. So we made him the standard bearer. I guess the squires are often the standard bearers, so we made him the standard bearers, just because the other standard bearers are going to be having trouble, because we know that Tommen and Larak are standard bearers, and Larak takes an arrow to his chest. So it just seemed like, okay, let's focus on another standard bearer falling. Yeah, and they say bolt. I think we just made it from an Illyrian crossbowman. Like, why not? All right, so then we get to the pit fighters. Barristan, according to the outline, Barristan glances back and sees the pit fighters. There are 200 of them, make enough noise for 2,000. The problem here is that in Barristan 1, they're already described as 300. Or no, he describes a few hundred, right? And at the end of it's just one of these like contradictions that we like. How do you handle it? I want to say it's probably going to be in this document here, page 50. Where are we at? Barristan 1, 43. These are these things about these like small little things that pay attention to. He talks about the Stormcrows, and then here's the pit fighters. He says several hundred pit fighters had gathered. So at the end of A Dance with Dragons, the pit fighters say they're going to bring 300. And so at first, you read this and you're like, okay, well, the pit fighters lied, or they weren't able to do it, and they brought 200. There's no problem there. But then in the previous chapter, he says several hundred. Well, 200 is not several hundred. Okay, 300. Maybe we can push 300. So that's what we did. We made it 300, not 200. So I don't know where the error is. Is the error George? Is the error the person that transcribed this? Is the error Barristan? But they had written several hundred, so we've got to up the pit fighters here. So we changed it to 300. And then one woman stands out with greaves, sandals, chainmail skirt, and a python. Barristan's shocked, watching her breasts bounce around, and thinking that this day will be his last. The pit fighters mostly shouting Lorak and Hisdar, but some call out Daenerys. Lorak hits his chest with an arrow, bringing Barristan's attention forward, but the squire keeps the banners high and shakes it off. So we got to do that. We have to deal with that. And so we get back to the story here. And it's, the Stormcrows, standard bearers drops the reins, and horror, dead and doomed to hell. Once the air is free from the arrows, he blows the horn to the Red Lamb, and then the pit fighters come out of the western gate, and then they're more noisy than numerous, poorly armored, 300 in all, but they scream like 3,000. I mean, what can you do? Is it several? Is it 300? Is it 200? Dissonant cries, company of braying mules with lions, Lorak, Hisdar, and here and there Daenerys. All Barristan thought of then. This is where we thought it was a good play. One of the editors pointed out that if Strong Belwas is going to be part of chapters later on, he was noticeably not in Barristan 1, despite at the end of A Dance with Dragons saying that he wanted to go fight with them. So we kind of needed some sort of recognition of like where Belwas is, because there's a contradiction. End of Dance with Dragons end one way, Belwas is going to fight. Beginning of Winds of Winter begins another way, especially if we're going to have Barristan, starring Belwas, like be a character in the Quentin chapter. So he thinks of strong Belwas. He should be here. Um, and so we need a reason for him not to be here. So we invent this little story of him descending from the pyramid and catching his breath and needing the privy, which kind of parallels Maester Dennis in the Arion sample chapter, as he kept stopping to slow their ascent. And so in the end, Missandei pleads, tricks him, or, says that, oh yeah, you need to protect me. Okay. So then we get to the surging mob, the naked Grieve sandals and chainmail skirt, as well as a python wrapped around her neck. It's strange that we try to deal with the rule, because he lists 4 things, and usually you have a rule of 3. So you kind of have to do this like ellipses thing. Naked for her greaves, her sandals, and a chainmail skirt, as well as a python wrapped around her neck. Sanera, she-stark, snake. Her breast bounced around wildly as she sprinted, snacking her pet with every stride. All my years, the battle can surprise me, And then he hoped the singers would give him a grand song in her memory. Certainly this day would be her last. So we're trying to do the same thing. And then the loud grunt, bringing his attention back to his cavalry. And beside him rode Larak the Lash, straight ahead with an arrow in his chest. And the thing is, like, how can Selmy not see somebody with an arrow in his chest and not think of Duskendale? Like, it just seems like of course he'd be thinking of Duskendale. So we're like, oh, okay, I get an arrow in the same spot, and so we kind of have transition into like him thinking about Duskendale, and what is he going to think about Duskendale? What is he going to think about the gods, maybe religion, like why their whole purpose for everything? And then we kind of came up with this, metaphor: the 7 gods weave tapestries too tall and wide for any man to behold in full. And it's like, oh, who's going to say it? Well, I think it was originally Lord Manfred, but it's like, let's switch it up and make it Hightower. Hightower could be a religious guy, because the Hightowers are connected to the faith and stuff like that. So, it was also that he's going to think about all these people in his life screaming on that wall. Let's give Hightower a shout out. And so then, where was the outline? The outline said that, this is where he finally makes it to the Harridan. But I think because we had mentioned Larak, we'd just be like, okay, if Barristan's feeling like Barristan's feeling about Larak, but it's like, shouldn't he then? He's now talked about the pit, the storm crows. He's talked about the pit fighters. We added the thing about the Dothraki. He has to talk about his lads. So now he's talking about Larak. We need to identify everybody that's in the battle now. So the only ones left is like Lamb and Tum. So we've got to talk about them too, his lads. So what are they doing? Okay, Tumco Low. He's got his royal black standard, mirroring Larak's, dragons to show our strength, white to show our purity. And then it's like, okay, Lamb. If they've got the banners, what is Red Lamb? Well, he's a sign of fury unto himself. These little poetic things. Okay, my boys, today they're true knights. But then it's like, okay, he says something like, I forget if it was the original submission or if it was an editor had put in, they're true knights worthy of the Queen's Guard. And then all of a sudden it's like, well, if he's thinking about them as sons, how does Barristan think about sons? How does he think about the fact that he never had kids? That's got to hurt, right? And then we kind of go into like all the things that he traded to be in the King's Guard, because he does call them the closest thing to sons in the previously. So we get into this like sad story of like, yeah, actually his father like was disappointed with him in joining the King's Guard. This is all just, most of this is fiction. And then, Lord Manfred would be disappointed as well. He wanted to take on Sir Barristan essentially to become his son-in-law. He wanted him to be a son. And so Sir Barristan's cousin married the Swan Girl, which is, in A Game of Thrones, Barristan says that his cousin married the girl that he was supposed to be betrothed to. And so we made it, it just seemed most logical that it would be Lord Manfred's daughter. And so we made his cousin marry the Swan Girl and be made heir of Harvest Hall in Barristan's stead. And this is all the things he's trading away. He's trading his Lord's cloak for a white cloak. And we're going to come back to those cloaks, because he eventually talks about his final cloak, only for King Joffrey to strip him of it. So now we're, racking up different people from his life that are all like being referenced now. And so now he's thinking about his Larak, Lam, and Tum being sons, and then I think an editor naturally added in, like, well, wouldn't he think about Daenerys being a daughter? Oh yeah, he's thinking about Daenerys being a daughter, but then wouldn't he be? Isn't it Barristan to be like, no, she's not your daughter, she's your queen. You're right. He's not. He might be sentimental, but then he's also like so honor bound that he would have that debate in his head. So a lot of these things, like these battles in Barristan's head, are actually a lot of organic writing from different people coming in and adding. Well, like, oh well, if he's thinking about he's thinking about it's funny how the process, right? He's mentioned everyone in battle, so he's got to mention his lads. Okay, well, he's mentioning his lads. Wouldn't he be mentioning that he thinks about them as sons? Okay, he's thinking about them as sons. Wouldn't he think about Daenerys as a daughter? Oh, but if he's thinking about Daenerys as a daughter, wouldn't he chastise himself for thinking about her as a daughter? So he'd be thinking about her as a queen. And it's these fun little add-on that and each of those steps is like logical. Like, yeah, no, that is what Barristan would do. So, and so finally we get to, I think the one criticism that a couple of people had was like, it does take so long to actually get into the battle, and I think it still works. The thing is that like writing battle is so hard, and like we tried to extend the battle and open it up as much as we could, because very little is even written about the battle. And still, it's a relatively short chapter. So let's get back into Barristan reaches the Harridan, and then this is a weirdly very specific thing on the Gaskari Legion. It's 6,000 strong, lined up to protect a trebuchet, 6 ranks deep. The first rank kneels, the second rank, and the rest have small throwing spears in case their comrades fall. And then he thinks the Maester's chain is only as strong as the weakest link, and identifies. So the I think it's there was some confusion in this write-up over if he was facing slaves or if he was facing the Legion of New Gis, and the Legion of New Gis is not slaves, of course. But again, we don't know if these are like who's making the errors here. So, because he later the person writing it up calls it a slave legion, and it's not. But so we switched it to it's New Gis. They're from New Gis, and so, and then Barristan thinks about a Maester's chain is only as strong as the weakest link, and identifies the companies of the Yunkish lords weaker than the slave legions. Well, certainly weaker than the slave legions. Well, it's not a slave legion, but so we cut this idea that it was a slave legion. It's a legion from New Gis, and so he targets the Little Pigeon and the Herons. And so if we go to the Barristan here, we get the same kind of descriptions. It's a host, 6,000 strong, more than his patchwork host. We had to like add that up, like. Got like 5,000 unsullied, 500 stormcrows, 300 pit fighters. It's close. 20 Dothraki, 3 three squires. So it's close to 6,000, but it's more, it's a little less. So then we talk, talk about make sure that they're from New Gis, and then the description. And again, it's the same kind of description: the first rank, second rank, but then it's important that their flanks are defended and things like this, because he doesn't want to face them. So where are you going to take a cavalry? Cavalry are always looking for flanks. It's like the most important thing that a cavalry does, is try to get around and flank or get people from behind. And so here I was like, okay, we need some sort of motivation for him to change his mind. So let's go back to that frightened boy. Let's go back to Hodor, finding his voice. And if we're talking about New Gis, let's bring up Astapor. And then I came up with this idea of King Cleon being this dead body heading into battle with no control over his destiny because he's dead. And all of a sudden it kind of became this meta thing about Barristan, right? Like, Barristan dies in the show, and I think a lot of fans have this idea that Barristan is just going to die in battle here, and this is his fate. And so in a sense, is Barristan a dead man riding already? Is he King Cleon? It's very meta, right? What's Barristan's fate? And so this is the story gets a little meta. But we got to summarize new King Cleon again, because this is a very kind of minor thing. People aren't going to remember King Cleon, so we talk about the Butcher King, and him being propped up on the horse and not working for the Astapori, and him getting scared, and this wall of fear. We need, we felt that there needed to be a good transition. He can't just suddenly be like, nope, not going to do it. We need, like, why is Barristan all of a sudden getting scared when it was established that he's not scared in battle? So we have to undo everything. And at this point, it's like, okay, we're wrapping it all up. Everything that we've seen so far, that the little boy is back, bringing back the beginning, and then all those little people that we were talking about, the religion he brought up, the stranger's embrace, him, his lads, the boys the sons issue that we had, his army, all the descriptions of the Stormcrows and the pit fighters we talked about, his queen. His eyes went wide as he raced towards the point. And then I got this fun idea when I was thinking about that, about Jaime Lannister and the White Book, because Selmy thinking about this being the end of his story. And I got this fun idea that, like, what would Barristan think about? Oh, he might think about Jaime Lannister writing in the White Book. And then it'd be really funny that Jaime Lannister, like, nimbly writing in the White Book with his, because of course, Jaime Lannister doesn't have a hand, but Selmy doesn't know that Jaime Lannister doesn't have a hand. So, like, this idea of, like, Jaime Lannister, like, arrogantly, like, quill in hand, nimbly writing in the book, like Barristan's story and how it would irk him, is a funny thing. Of course, it's just like the ridiculous ideas that Barristan has, because Jaime Lannister isn't nimbly writing anything, right? So this summary of Barristan is from A Storm of Swords up until a point. Sir Barristan Selmy ellipses because it's long in A Storm of Swords. But near the end, it's dismissed from service by King Joffrey I Baratheon in his 61st year for reasons of advanced age. And then that's where it ends. And so we kind of continue, like, what would be written? Named Lord Commander of Queensguard too. And before it was like Queen Daenerys Targaryen, and then it's like, well, wait a minute, they wouldn't want to give her any props by calling her a queen. Or even, so they would just call her Daenerys Stormborn of Slaver's Bay. They would not call her they don't want to give her any honor at all. And so it also takes even away from this idea that, maybe some people wouldn't even think she's a Targaryen. And then you got to get very brief, like in the same writing style as the book. Like, after his queen's disappearance, conspired to depose a royal consort and rule of a marine, died impaled upon a pike. Was that the end of his story? The last thread in his tapestry, bringing back the Gerald Hightower to perish here. Would the gods have him die so boldly, bringing back his Barristan the Bold, his child thing, bring about the gods. He saw another face before him. The Prince of Dragonflies, of course, a bold boy. Then, of course, Duncan the Tall, says this to Barristan when he's named, and he says, "No, I'm no Cleon, not yet." And this big meta statement, right? Like, this doesn't have to be the end of Barristan Selmy. This doesn't have to be the end of his story. He doesn't have to die like he does in the show. It's not a foregone conclusion that Barristan is dead here. Okay, that Barristan is having free will and the decision to be his own man and not die at this point, not just run into those spears. There's consequences for this, as we'll see. So he says, the trebuchet could wait. And then we get to a maester's chain is only the strongest, weakest link. I thought it was kind of weird that Barristan would just be using a maester analogy. So we put in that Pycelle is the one that said it. But then when would Pycelle say it? You ask these questions. How about he said it when Jon Arryn chose Peter Baelish to be on the small council? Yeah, that's all right. Okay. And then it's like, well, how would Barristan feel about Pycelle? Well, Barristan's, he's pretty humble. He's not that smart. He would probably think that Pycelle was a fucking genius, like he's probably totally fooled by Pycelle. So he's probably like, it's a good saying, and the Grand Maester may have been the wisest man that he'd ever known. Oh, by the way, I just thought of it here, but one thing to note about Barristan chapters is he's never called Barristan. He's always called Sir Barristan, or he's called Selmy, or he's called Barristan Selmy, or he's called the Old Knight. But he's never called Barristan, which is interesting, right? Another thing is that George R. R. Martin is very, very careful to not really use Sir Barristan or Selmy or any reference to the character more than once, maybe twice in a paragraph. So he's very big on saying like he, or so you don't get Sir Barristan, it's Sir Barristan, Sir Barristan. It's like he limits it. So sometimes it gets to the point where it's kind of confusing, like who you're talking about, but he doesn't want to overfill a paragraph with a character's name. Unlike, say, like if you read Harry Potter, Harry, every sentence begins with Harry, but like, I actually had to go through this and like kind of remove Sir Barristan's, remove Selmy's, in order to bring it down. But this is why you get sentences like this next one. A jerk on the rein veered the silver to the right. It's not Sir Barristan jerked the rein or Selmy jerked the rein. It's like, well, let's try to limit the number of times the character's name is actually said, which George R. R. Martin does. It's really weird. With me, he called, and his army followed. And so here we get onto the Herons. So north of the Herons stood the 500 slave soldiers he spotted earlier. We just came up with that number 500. That seemed about right, because we know that the some of the wise masters have only a few dozen, some have thousands. So like, put something in the middle that there's 500 Herons. It's got to be an amount that it's like a good amount for Barristan's force of 500 horse and 300 pit fighters to be able to slaughter. And it's like, well, what are we going to say about them? And so I thought about this long and hard, and what to say about these herons, and like, what would they look like? And for some reason, it came up to me that like, okay, they look like a field of flowers, because then we can relate it to Ashara Dane and him like plucking flowers. Like, I had this idea of like him beheading a heron is like plucking a flower. But what flowers are pink? Did a lot of research on flowers and history, and even though carnations are not mentioned in Ice and Fire, carnations are a very old flower that people have had for a long time, so certainly in the Middle Ages, and they're pink, and there's not many other, ancient pink flowers, so carnations became it, that they were this the herons are this field of carnations swaying in the breeze. And so then we get into his past, because I knew that I needed to mention a Shardane, like in a Barristan chapter. You just gotta use any chance to mention a Shardane and mention Harrenhal at some point. So there were carnations in Harrenhal's godwood. It had been a false spring, but they bloomed nonetheless. They should have plucked one for her. It was just, getting nice. He's gonna pluck this head. He could have done that much. There's no crown of blue roses. The Kingsguard must do as he's bid. And this is the implication that he was ordered to fall by Rhaegar. Just this once, Sir Barristan, the prince had said. In A Dance with Dragons, he describes his falling as a failure. And let me get the actual line. And, it sounds like, admittedly, it sounds like on first read that, here we go. He says that he says, but of all his failures, if I had unhorsed Rhaegar and crowned Ashara, Queen of Love and Beauty, might have she looked my way. Might she have looked to me instead of Stark. He would have never known, but of all of his failures, none haunted Barristan Selmy so much as that. And yeah, when you think of it like that, it sounds like, that he lost to Rhaegar and that's his failure. But I think it's more interesting that his failure is actually doing his prince's bidding dishonorably, like throwing a match, throwing a tilt, that was really his failure, was listening to Rhaegar. And I understand he likes Rhaegar and Rhaegar was his prince and all this kind of stuff. And, but he was asked to do, if he's asked to do something dishonorable and then he does something dishonorable and it starts a war, like, is that not also a failure? So I think, it's maybe controversial to make this little change that Barristan threw the match, but it helps explain how Rhaegar won Harrenhal. Because all the other people he beat, all the other people that beat are his boys. It's his boys, right? It's Wentz and Arthur Dane, and defeating them and like defeating one Kingsguard after the other to win when he's not that good of a jouster is a little weird. But Barristan's the last one, so how does he beat Barristan? How does he beat Barristan the Bold? Well, he asked him to fall. I just think it makes more sense logically, and it just takes a little bit. It's a little bending of the rules, I'll say. Because he sees it as a failure. Well, he sees it as a failure for, not because he couldn't beat Rhaegar, but because of something else. And so you get into Barristan's head here. Ellie had been very sick after the birth of her girl. It would lift her spirits. Made him feel better about being dishonorable. So then we get into going back to the outline. Barristan targets the Little Pigeon and the herons. The slaves were freakishly tall. That was before they were pulled on stilts. Pink scales, steel beaks. Barristan thinks they're going to be blind because of the dawn rising over the city and break ranks. And so he turns away from the Legion and heads for the herons. We move the turn away. And then he cuts off the head of the herons. And he knocks over 3 others and they fall over. And they scatter and run away, and led by the Little Pigeon himself. We're going to get into that. So most of that pretty much happens, but we just have a little longer description of the herons. that they described that they're Pajar Zomirix. Um, it's actually kind of a little weird that Barristan calls them the Little Pigeon, because these are names that the Windblown had called them, but somehow it spread to the other sellsword companies and then to him. So we kind of mentioned that it's mocked by the sellswords, that this is how he's calling him the Little Pigeon. Small of stature, because like Barristan Selmy meets for instance the rabbit, and he doesn't call him the rabbit, like and this is like the next day, like so it doesn't really make sense, but this is what George had. Like had it weren't me writing it from scratch, it doesn't seem logical that he would know that they were called the Little Pigeon, but George had put that he calls them the Little Pigeon. So just add a little more description of things, like why he's called the Little Pigeon. Bred as chattel before they put on stilts, towering above men. And then I was like, we'll slip in this little thing from Galaza Galera. Herons are fierce magical creatures, blush servants of the goddess gifts. Perhaps they were, but these were only men, and no man. One of the editors said, no man could fly. That's kind of a reference to Bran. No man born can fly. The rising sun will blind them. Getting back, they will break. And so he sped on, and we get this wall. Again, we get this summary of everything that's been in the chapter. The Stormcrows, his lads, the Pitfighters, his father, Lord Manfred, the White Bull, Prince Rhaegar, the Prince of Dragonflies, his kings, Jaehaerys, Aerys, Robert, Joffrey, and his queen Daenerys. Her scream was loudest. Yeah, we don't have anything about Jaehaerys. Maybe sometime we should talk about King Jaehaerys. And then, my money line here. All I could see, however, were carnations. Boom! Sir Barristan Selmy strikes the first blow, but it was a near thing. The silver pushed ahead of the Red Lamb's horse. This is what kind of said. He talks about his boys entering the fray in the outline. It's a clean slice. The head seemed to float through the air, impossibly slow, like a pink petal upon the wind. That one flew after all. The idea that the carnations they did fly after all. And then all at once, crashing of heron and horse, metal and feathers, howls all too human. And we had a lot of like bird references in this. Then the same kind of things happens. He plows forward, the herons fall into three others, they tumble over like children's books, giving back the kids. Side of log caused Morris to turn and flee, crests bouncing with each clumsy step. Panic begot panic, all running. And then it became a hunt. We're just trying to extend this battle, like violence and descriptions of it to make it really harsh, because this is a battle chapter, and so we need to have more, especially considering how much introduction we had. Swing after swing, red spray filled the air, outlined against the lightning sky. It was a great mist erupt from the waves, breaking upon rocks, like the shores of Stonehelm, as the seas were bone and blood. All the getting into poetry. This is the stuff that takes so long. And then you just get into this description of them dying. Widower dealing chops. The red lambs smashing pink armor, if they see a warhammer, adding feathers to the plumage, the feathers of the arrows, adding to the feathers of the herons. And then we kind of dealt with the fact that like there's a little bit of lack of logic here, because Barristan spends all this time at the end of A Dance with Dragons talking about how only 3 of his boys are perhaps ready to fight. He mentions a few others that he doesn't bring, but he brings the 3 most talented ones, Larrick, Tom, and Red Lamb. And he takes the 2 most talented and he gives them banners so they can't even fight. So it's ridiculous. But nonetheless, they're there knocking off people in order to shoving people off balance. And then the pit fighters come in, and we try to make the pit fighters as kind of savage and horror. It's like horror, this like chopping pit fighters coming in. And so then, there's this thing about the Little Pigeon, Where are we? So we get into the Little Pigeon, and we thought, he's falling over there, and we know that the Little Pigeon is described. If he's described as almost a dwarf in A Dance with Dragons. So the minute I was like, almost a dwarf, and it just kind of dawned that, like, oh my god, like, Barristan, it's hilarious if Barristan, like, thinks he's Tyrion, like, that he mistakes him for Tyrion Lannister. Like, it's gotta, like, once you start thinking this kind of stuff, it's just like, you gotta write about it once it's like there. So for a moment, he thought it was Tyrion Lannister, and he snorts absurdly. And then, like, what did Barristan think about Tyrion Lannister? He probably wouldn't have liked him. So he's like, he's probably drunk in a King Landing brothel, useless creature that he is. The big joke that Tyrion is actually across the battlefield. Now, what's hilarious here is, it's an unintentional but kind of cool, is that some people were like, oh, this is a really cool fake out. It's like, it didn't even intend it as a fake out. It just intended as a funny joke that he would think that the Little Pigeon was Tyrion. But yeah, it happens to be a fake out. Like, if you're reading this, you're like, oh, when we last left Tyrion, he was one place. Could Tyrion be here? Has Barristan seen Tyrion in battle? Well, no, it's not Tyrion in battle. It's the Little Pigeon. And so he trips, just like in the outline, he trips over. He says, "Mercy, mercy." And he gets his head smashed in, which is, what happens in the, what am I doing here? Which is what happens in the, he says he begs for mercy. I came for blood, not gold. All that there. He knocks in his head with a mace. Oh, I think we changed it to a sword. Yeah, we changed Red Lamb's item into a sword. I think, hopefully his weapon is not different in two different places. Spattering blood all over the Sir Barristan's horse. Okay. How are we? An hour? Yeah, I guess we'll talk about the rest in part 2. All right. So part 2 coming. We'll break here. It's been an hour. All right. Talk to you soon. Bye.